It's good to see all of you this evening. I want to mention this right now before I forget. I appreciate all of the table sponsors for helping to make this event possible. There are many pastors, there are a couple state representatives, other ministries who have sponsored tables, and I want to thank you for helping to underwrite this event. So with that said, it is an honor to have Dr. Al Mohler join Commonwealth Policy Center this evening for this event. Dr. Mohler currently serves as the president of Southern Theological Baptist Seminary. I'm sorry, this probably irks you when people get this wrong, doesn't it, Dr. Mohler? It's actually Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, one of the largest seminaries in the world. He hosts two programs, The Briefing and Thinking in Public. He also writes a popular blog and a regular commentary on moral, cultural, and theological issues. The Chicago Tribune called him an articulate voice for conservative Christianity at large, and the Time.com called him the reigning intellectual of the evangelical movement in the United States. Dr. Mohler has authored numerous books, including his most recent, called The Gathering Storm, Secularism, Culture, and the Church. Dr. Mohler's mission is to address contemporary issues from a consistent and explicit Christian worldview. Dr. Mohler, you're a man after my own heart. I want to thank you personally for what you mean to God's kingdom and to the church here in the United States. So if you will, please welcome with me Dr. Albert Mohler.
Thank you. Well, good evening. It's an honor to be with you all here and look forward to some very interesting conversation. But I have the opportunity to try to kind of lay out a bit of the challenge we face, the landscape we now occupy. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and say that you have to know where to begin. And so I want you to imagine that we're drawing a line in history at about 1500. And you say, this is going to be a very long night. If you're going back to 1500, well, actually we need to go back further than that. Because we're going to start out tonight by asking the question, how could we arrive at a time when the very existence of boys and girls, men and women, is now rejected by the cultural elites in our society? When you have an administration in Washington that refers to pregnant people, you don't get there by accident. You have to explain how in the world you could come to such a position as this, understanding that what we are facing now is genuinely new in human history. A depth of confusion, a level of confusion that goes beyond anything we might imagine. But one of the things I hope to accomplish in our conversation tonight is the understanding that all of these issues are tied together. That we're never looking at a set of disconnected issues like BBs in a box. Instead, we are looking at the unraveling of a fabric. And so you have to understand that even as you look at individual threads, what's actually happening is the dismantling of an entire civilization. Now, I said we're going to start in 1500. We're going to go back a lot further than that, to Genesis 3. Because in order to understand how all of this can be understood and explained, you're going to have to go back to the fall. And we're going to have to look at the fall more deeply than most evangelical Christians have ever done. Because what we need to see is that it is the beginning of something without which we can't explain the world we're looking at today. But why did I go to 1500? Because 1500 is an interesting break in world history. The thoughts began to be accessible to human beings in about 1500 that weren't accessible before. And so among those ideas were the ideas that civilization might not be Catholic. Now you're saying this sounds like a very long history story. Well, it is in one sense, but just understand that if you go back to the beginnings of the 1500s, all of Western civilization as we know it was tied to a unitary understanding where the throne and the altar, the king, emperor, the prince, and the pope were all basically one great authority structure. And so you had one great authority structure, and there's almost no one outside that authority structure. If you are outside that authority structure, you're an alien or a heretic, or both. A very vulnerable position to be in for all kinds of good reasons when you consider the reality of heresy. But the fact is that if you go back and you say the 16th century, okay, what happened? Well, the Protestant Reformation took place. And one of my favorite things to do in taking people through Europe is just to say, look, here's a place where one day it was this and then the next day it was that. Simply in like the snap of a finger in world history. But what the Protestant Reformation brought about was having to now think about government and think about society and think about the relationship of the church and the state in a way that people hadn't had to think about it before. You basically had a unified picture. But then fast forward, let's just say, to the 18th century. And you have the Enlightenment. And what the Enlightenment did was to bring an alternative intellectual authority into the world in Western civilization. An alternative intellectual authority to Christianity. And so by the time you get to the 18th century and the philosophers of the Enlightenment, the idea of authority and intellectual authority, who gets to say what's true, who gets to say what's good, who gets to say what's right, who gets to say what's beautiful, it shifts from what was a required agreement between the throne and the altar, between the church and the state, to this independent understanding of truth, right, text, like Constitution or Bible, that was liberated. That was the idea of the Enlightenment. That's why they call it an Enlightenment, as if everything before it was dark. That's a slander, but nonetheless, the idea was all of a sudden we now discovered the power of human reason, separated and independent from Scripture, different from the authority of the church, to define reality, to establish law, to decide what is good, to define human flourishing. Well, now maybe the relevance of this becomes more clear. What we are looking at right now in the year 2022, in the United States of America, in Western civilization, in the Commonwealth of Kentucky, is the inevitable consequence of the unraveling that all of this has brought about. Now, my purpose tonight is not to say let's rewind history to 1500. Frankly, I don't want a dentist from 1500. The modern world has brought many good things that we enjoy, including the lights that are allowing us to meet and antibiotics, and you just go down the list. There are many good things that the modern age has brought, but with the modern age has come the unraveling of that very fabric. And so for a long time, it didn't appear to be catastrophic. And that's because you can think of Western civilization as an iceberg. An iceberg breaks off of an ice shelf, and it drifts off into the water. And of course becomes, as we well know, a hazard to navigation. But you also know, just because we've all been to elementary school, that the biggest part of the iceberg is under the surface of the water. And you know that the moment an iceberg is separated from the ice shelf, it begins to melt. But the point is this: it takes a very, very long time for a very big iceberg to melt. And that's the way Western civilization has worked. It's been melting, but it's been melting slowly. It's not melting slowly anymore. It reminds me of a famous economist who described bankruptcy, personal bankruptcy. He said it happens very slowly until it happens very fast. Like in 24 hours, everything can change instantly. Well, if that's in financial terms, what we're watching is a very similar pattern taking place in morality, even the definition of reality, and it's affecting the Commonwealth of Kentucky. One of the conceits, one of the assumptions of many people, including conservatives and conservative Christians, is that you could have places like San Francisco and New York go crazy. You could have Berkeley and Austin and Miami, but you would always have Paducah and Andalusia, Alabama. You'd always have places safe from such ridiculous radical ideas? Well, by now you know there is no place that's safe. And there are a couple of reasons for that. We'll talk about that in a moment. But one of the main things is to recognize that what conservatives consistently underestimate is the fact that what the left demands is not an adjustment but a surrender. So when you think of something like, just say, same-sex marriage, again, which I do not believe is actually marriage. I know the state of Kentucky says that it is, because the Supreme Court in the Obergefell decision in 2015 said that it is, but I don't believe that it is. But nonetheless, if you take such an issue, the reality is that the LGBTQ rights movement would not be satisfied to have 95% of the United States and its population covered by legalized same-sex marriage. They must have 100%. Not only that, they must change the entire moral instinct of the society so that the morality is flipped. I often cite the idea of a moral revolution. A moral revolution works this way. Three things have to happen for a moral revolution to take place. Number one, what was celebrated must be condemned. Okay, secondly, what was condemned must be celebrated. And then those who will not celebrate must be condemned. Does that make sense? So what was condemned must be celebrated. Just take homosexual behavior. It was condemned, now it is celebrated. Secondly, what was celebrated must be condemned. You could say Orthodox Christianity and its biblical understanding of sexuality. Now it must be condemned. And then the third part is those who will not celebrate the new morality must be condemned. And that's what we see. And that's the cancel culture that's going on, where even to question this new moral order means that you are now banned. All polite, intelligent, morally sophisticated people are to avoid you. And we're living in a time of unprecedented power to shut down, deplatform, silence those who are unwanted voices in this society. But I wanted to kind of lay that foundation in order to say that conservative Christians and conservatives in general, because conservatives always respond to a problem. That's why they're conservatives. That's why one of my great projects in life is to help define the conservative movement. I'm working on a book right now seeking to do that. And so you sometimes hear conservatism referred to as reactionary. And the reason for that is because we generally understand conservatism because we're reacting to something we see as dangerous and wrong, such as the French Revolution. And so modern conservatism as we know it, really in the English-speaking world, came out of horrified reactions to the radicality, the murderousness, the genocidal mentality, the rejection of order, and the rejection of God that was seen in the French Revolution. And so, by the way, it's another story. The English-speaking revolution, including the American revolutions, were revolutions of ordered liberty. The American Revolution was not a revolution like the French Revolution. The American Revolution didn't say we want to completely undo and replace the moral order that we had inherited from the English-speaking tradition. No, they said we're going to improve upon it. And so that's a very different thing. But nonetheless, conservatism is a response to a horrifying reality that awakens conservatives to what conservatives have always believed but never had to say out loud because everybody believed it before. Do you recognize that most of you are now operating, most of you, certainly as pastors and as leaders in society, you're walking around with ammunition for a definition of marriage you did not need 30 years ago. Yeah, and it is because now you have to define exactly what you're talking about. You have to be very clear. And so there's a sense in which, and I don't mean conservative and Christian are exactly the same thing. That's a different discussion. But let's put it this way. The heart of conservatism is conserving what is right in the world. And Christianity is the way of explaining at the deepest, truest level the truth of the world, that which we're trying to conserve. So when we're trying to conserve the American constitutional tradition, yes, but we're also now trying to conserve the meaning of male and female. And that's the strange world we're in today. So just to talk about how some of these issues emerged. The revolt against the established moral order did not start with gender, but it did, in a very big way, really start with sex. It really did start with marriage. And so as you're looking at this, you recognize that you can't get to same-sex marriage from 1495. You're going to have to explain what in the world could have happened in order that you could end up with, and this just to use same-sex marriage as perhaps the clearest example. You could use the abortion issue, any number of other issues in the same way. But marriage is so easy, it's required that every society define marriage. So in other words, every society has had to write out what it thinks about marriage in a way it hasn't necessarily had to write out what it thinks about everything else. So you look at this and you recognize it did begin with sex. Pitirim Sorokin founded the Department of Sociology at Harvard University. And you say, well, that sounds like a strange person to grow up. But he's one of the good guys. He was 3 times under a death sentence from Lenin. He escaped from the Soviet Union and came to the United States and ended up founding that Department of Sociology. And just a great deal of wisdom in his understanding of the world. He says that the first responsibility of any society is to reproduce, and he meant that biologically. And by the way, that is still the first responsibility of a society, which also tells you of a huge alarm bell that ought to be going off. When you look at the decline of marriage and the decline of the birth rate, the fertility rate as it's called, or the total fertility rate as the demographers call it, it's catastrophic in the United States. Now, we're not yet Japan, where they're having to create robots to take care of people in nursing homes, and that's not a joke. That is literally true. And I pointed out just the other day, I'm mentioning it on the briefing in the morning, that there's a tipping point that no one knew to talk about before, and that's the tipping point in a society to when the sales of adult diapers eclipse that of the sale of infant diapers. You never knew to watch that before, but hey, stay tuned. But in Japan, it has already happened, as a matter of fact, a few years ago. And you look at that and you go, let's just point out the obvious. Pitirim Sorokin wanted us to know this. A society can't survive the absence of babies. And the absence of babies has an explanation. But the second thing Pitirim Sorokin said, he said the second task of every civilization is to bank the raging river of human sexuality. No, that's important to know. And in other words, every society has got to decide what are the rules we are going to follow when it comes to sex, and that's when it comes to marriage, and when it comes to taking responsibility for children. You're going to do that. By the way, his third thing that every society has to do is to figure out how to make certain that a sufficient number of boys become men. And then you say, well, it's like he's reading our headlines. Because that's a big part of our crisis today. And by the way, throughout all of human history, it has not taken an enormous amount of civilizational energy to produce women, girls who will grow up to be women. No civilization's had a hard time with that, ever. Every civilization from Cain and Abel on has had to invest a lot in transforming boys into men. That's the challenge. Not biologically, but morally and culturally. But again, going back to Sorokin, every society has to define where it is on sex. And so in the modern age, all of a sudden, you had efforts to try to redefine sexual expectation. And yet, for most of the centuries, even of the modern age, that was pretty much limited to an elite. You had to be a prince or a king to misbehave that much. And the reason was because of the power of Christianity. The power of Christianity and its moral judgment was so powerful in society that there just wasn't the opportunity for a whole lot of sexual misbehavior. You certainly did not have the pattern of people declaring themselves by their sexual interests in medieval villages. Is that safe to say? You did not have people wearing gay pride T-shirts in medieval Germany. I'm just going to go and say, I will stand without fear of refutation. All right. And it was because there was a much more unified society. But remember the iceberg? The iceberg has begun to melt. And it melted first at the level of the elites. If you have enough money, you can misbehave. If you have enough power, you can misbehave. But most people have no such opportunity to misbehave. But all that began to change with some patterns that we now recognize are very much a part of our civilization. First of all, the move to cities. And you think, well, this is a very odd thing for him to be talking about. No, I want you to understand, you cannot have widespread moral rebellion without cities, because you do not have widespread moral rebellion on farms. By the way, my father told me at one point when he was having he was a wonderful, godly Christian dad, and we were having one of those talks a Christian dad has with his firstborn son. And my father at one point told me, he said, my father never had this conversation with me because I grew up on a farm. All was explained. There were some details to fill in, but generally I understood the entire picture. And the other thing is that the agrarian context resists nonsense. You know, well, you can say, yeah, I think the idea of weeds is a socially constructed reality and it's a matter of patriarchal prejudice. You know what, though? No one's buying your weeds. I mean, the bottom line is that in agrarian rural context, and by the way, the more agrarian, the more rural you are, the more you depend upon your family. So the clearer you are about who's responsible for whom. And not only that, the more you depend upon your community, the more you depend upon your neighbors. And that requires a certain form of social conservatism that you lose in the city. There's also something else. In a more rural agrarian context, and that explains why the state of Kentucky is not the same thing as the city of Boston, okay? So there are a lot of reasons here, but one of them has to do with the fact that we still have a distributed population. And this is what red America looks like. It still has a distributed population. And the United States still has a distributed population. I'm headed to California at the end of next week. I'll be there for several days, speaking on a lot of campuses. It's an interesting experience. But one of the most interesting things is that when you're in California and you're talking to people on the far left, they don't think Kentucky exists. It's not portrayed in television. It's not where their novels are written. How in the world does this keep happening? It's like every 4 years, the Electoral College is a reminder to people in Berkeley, there are other states. You know, the Atlantic Ocean is not on the eastern border of California. And for that matter, Massachusetts isn't next door either. But you look at that and you recognize, okay, so we see the development of cities nonetheless. So I often mention this. The closer you get to a city, the closer you get to a coast. Coastlines have always been liberalizing. And it's another reason why the interior of the country changes more slowly. And it is because ocean-based commerce brings new ideas and new moralities that take a lot longer to get inland. And so there's another reason why you talk about, port cities. Even in the New Testament, there are references, or even the Old Testament for that matter, in Phoenicia, there are references to cities on the coast, and they're not compliments. And so you look at that and you say, and again, I grew up in Florida, so they're never far from the coast. I'm not throwing my folks under, but I'm simply saying that the closer you get to a coast, the more liberal the culture is. The closer you get to a city. Cities also offer anonymity. And so you can't misbehave too much in the country without somebody knowing. But you can misbehave in the city. And a friend of mine who's a pastor in New York City says, he says to all the 20-somethings who move to New York City and think it's going to be cool, he says, you're about to find out who you are because everything you might be is going to be available. So you're about to find out who you actually are. And the closer you get to the coast, the closer you get to the city, the closer you get to the campus. Because the most secularizing engines in our society are the engines of higher education. And by the way, I hate to say this, but let's be honest, this is where Berkeley moves to Lexington. And I'm not isolating Louisville, trust me. I'm just saying where you have a major university, or for that matter, given the way faculty are hired at most even colleges, where you have a college that's aspirational, wants to make a name for itself, it's hiring people who are trained in places that are going to be far more liberal, far more secular, and they feel beholden to an intellectual culture that draws them to the left, not to the right. And so the campus, the city, the coast, well, now you can understand much about where we are. We fast forward and we understand that even in the beginning of the 20th century, here's something that will shock you. I think it will. Until the year 1929, so I mean, there are people alive who are, like my mother-in-law was born in 1924. She's still alive, 97 years old. So in her lifetime, until 1929, not one Christian church offered any legitimacy whatsoever to contraception or birth control. Now, I'm not here to give a lecture on contraception and birth control other than to say there's a reason why the Christian church has at least believed that marriage ought to produce children. Now, I've written on this, and again, I just threw a rock in the middle of the pool. All I'm saying is this. The Christian worldview says that marriage is to be open to the gift of children. I'm not arguing the Catholic argument that every single marital encounter must be equally open to the gift of children. I'm simply saying until 1929, Catholics and Protestants were in exactly the same position. Even if you had different reasons, we're exactly in the same position. And the reason was this. It is because the moment you can have sex without reference to children, sex becomes something it was never intended to be. And he's saying, well, okay, this sounds dangerous. Well, just understand, you cannot have the revolution in morality without this. And again, I am not making an argument tonight. Don't tweet that he came to talk about birth control. I've written about it. Takes longer to write that chapter than I can talk about here. My point is that the moral change we now know that includes everything from same-sex marriage to the transgender revolution, that took place in a far shorter amount of time than most of us recognize. And you can fast forward even from the 1920s when Christian churches many of them began to reconsider contraception and birth control. You have to get all the way to the 60s before any of those churches, even the most liberal of them, are contemplating legalized abortion or even the divorce revolution. But by the time you get to the 1970s, the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, so from 1929 to 1973, the world utterly changed morally. And so now, because of the divorce revolution and the advent of no-fault divorce, you put together same-sex marriage and no-fault divorce, I guess you get same-fault divorce. But if you have the advent of no-fault divorce, now every marriage is good for so long as both want to be married. It is no longer till death we do part. Civilization has just redefined its most basic institution of marriage and made it something temporary, at will, rather than an objective reality that is established by God and is unbreakable except in the most extreme and biblical of circumstances. And then, of course, you have the second wave feminism that comes along, saying that, you remember Betty Friedan saying that the home is a domestic concentration camp? And the second wave feminism came along, and by the way, second wave feminists are the most endangered people on planet Earth right now because they actually think they know who women are. There's actually no point. It's like Andrew Sullivan, very prominent gay activist, says there's absolutely no fun being gay if you don't know who a man is. He's not big on the transgender movement. Neither is Billie Jean King, Martina Navratilova. But nonetheless, you look at this, and that second wave feminism came along and said, look, you cannot liberate women unless you liberate them from being a wife, being a mother, and the cult of domesticity, that's what they called it, in the home. And so you get the antipathy towards the natural family, the antipathy towards the home, the antipathy towards gendered roles. And by the way, this is one of the great frustrations of the world around us. The great frustration, and one of them, and perhaps the most central of them, is that the differences between men and women won't go away. And, I did a national radio show for 10 years. I can still remember, I did one, and several on the differences between boys and girls, and just talking this through, which should be obvious, but these days you have to make the obvious obvious. That's part of our Christian responsibility. And so I was talking about the fact that there are differences that cannot be explained by the prejudice of parents. Because the liberals say, look, the only reason why you have these gendered expectations of boys and girls, the only reason why boys like to play this way and girls like to play that way is because parents have encouraged them to do so. I had a mom call one time, and she said, I don't think it works that way. And she said, I really tried it. She said, I gave my sons, like 4 and 6, I gave them Barbie dolls. And she said, took away anything that was military, anything that looked like a gun, so they can't have it. And says, so they're going around with the Barbie doll cocked like a gun. They're pointing, they're pointing one leg of Barbie at each other and going bang, bang. And so in other words, there's something deeper going on here. And again, part of Pitirim Sorokin, again, I'm just going back to him, it's common sense. This was taught at Harvard in the first half of the 20th century. At Harvard, the head of the sociology department at Harvard was saying in the first half of the 20th century, if you do not find a way to transform boys into workable men, society is going to fall apart. And now, I don't think he'd be allowed on campus, much less, made head of the department. It'd be unthinkable. But the difference is that boys haven't changed. Harvard has. Marriage hasn't fundamentally changed. Hollywood has. And morality, actually, in terms of the God-given morality that is implanted in creation, it hasn't changed. Washington has. And so we have to understand what we're up against. And I really want to encourage the work of all of you. And I realize there are many, not only the center and not only, state government, and most importantly, I have to say to the pastors in the room, but we all understand that we have a very different challenge right here in Kentucky than we had just a matter of a very short amount of time ago. I have been president at Southern Seminary and Boys College now almost 30 years. I was elected president in 1993. And that is, all I have to do is look at pictures of myself when I was elected to know that was a long time ago. But just think morally what that was a long time ago. I was trying to explain, I was speaking to a group of pro-life leaders in Dallas last week. And I said, you have to understand, I'm 62. I look at the world differently than a 20 or 30-year-old pro-life activist, because I am looking at the Dobbs case now before the Supreme Court, recognizing that I remember what it was like to think that we are on the threshold of a major win for the sanctity of human life in the Casey decision in 1992, only to see it turn to dust. Now, I think we have good reason to believe that we are far less likely to see the Dobbs case turn to dust. And by the way, please put that on your prayer, daily prayer concern as you're thinking about our nation, you're thinking about saving the lives of the unborn. That decision will not solve our problem, but we cannot make much progress until Roe v. Wade is reversed. And so be praying about that. But I just saying that's 30 years. That's about the same 30 years that I've been here. And I'm speaking to you tonight with the sense that when I became president of Southern Seminary in 1993, there wasn't one jurisdiction on planet Earth that would allow a man to marry a man or a woman to marry a woman. Not one legal jurisdiction on planet Earth. And the first came in the Netherlands, you may remember. And it came in the last half of that decade. And then you also look at other realities, and you just recognize that the abortion challenge that we faced, going back to the 1970s, the 1990s, we were talking about surgical abortion. Now we're looking at medical abortion. We're looking at the fact that even as we are making progress in terms of not just changing the law, but even reaching American hearts and minds for the sanctity and the personhood of the unborn. The reality is that abortion is now available by mail, at least for many of the early weeks of pregnancy. And we're looking at a challenge that even just 30 years ago wasn't imaginable. And then if you look at the letters LGBTQ, and again, those letters did not exist in 1993 as any coherent form of communication. But here we are, LGBTQ. And the thing you have to recognize is that it holds together through L and G and B. But it all falls together with T. Because L and G and B, that is to say lesbian and gay and bisexual, they all depend upon knowing the difference between XX and XY chromosomes, knowing the difference between male and female. And then it's because of politics and sexual liberation ideology that the T gets added. But the T is the refutation of L and G and B. It's only together because of the pact to have a common front against traditional morality. That's all you have to understand. The LGB doesn't fit together when you add T and Q and plus sign. Don't forget that plus sign because it's real. More's coming. In other words, their common cause is to limit the influence of Christian morality because it's what puts a damper on the entire alphabet. So here we are. I was asked to address just a few things of a particular urgency. Another thing we have to note is that you can't have a moral revolution the way the left wants a moral revolution without eliminating religious liberty. You cannot have a church free to preach, and you cannot have Christians, say, in a Christian counseling ministry, free to give biblical counsel. You cannot have Christian parents free to be the moral authorities in the lives of their own children and teenagers if you're going to have a successful moral revolution. You have to constrain, curtail, redefine religious liberty, and that is what we are seeing. Some of you, no doubt, are aware, and I've tried to give a lot of attention to it in recent days and weeks. Last week, one of the most crucial episodes in the history of religious liberty in the United States took place on this issue of a so-called ban on conversion therapy, and it wasn't in Berkeley, it was in West Lafayette, Indiana. That remains still right across the Ohio River. It's then our next state. Indiana is red America. It's flyover country for Hollywood and for New York City. But then again, how do you explain it? Campus. Remember, closer you get to a coast, closer you get to a city, closer you get to a campus. West Lafayette, campus, has a lot to do with it. So you had the city council there very seriously making absolute progress towards adopting a ban on so-called conversion therapy. By the way, I'm a Christian theologian. I don't believe in conversion therapy. Classical conversion therapy is not a Christian counseling methodology. It's a form of behavioralism, which, again, I as a Christian reject. But what I hold on to as a Christian is conversion. And that is what the Christian church promises. But that conversion is to produce holiness, is to take the shape of obedience and sanctification. That means obedience to God's plan, and that means in Scripture and in creation. And that means, yes, sexuality is limited to a man and a woman in the covenant of marriage. And that's the only authorized arena. And male and female is not defined by Hollywood. It is defined by God in creation. And so just to say that, you recognize that a ban on, and by the way, the proposed ban on conversion therapy would have done two things that at least one major church there in West Lafayette was awakened to. We're not going to be able to give biblical counsel. This will criminalize our church's counsel on the basis of Scripture. And someone comes in saying, especially a young person or a teenager, so let's just say a teenager, comes in struggling with, say, same-sex attraction as it's diagnosed now or described, or gender confusion, the church would commit a criminal act by saying, You shall and you shall not. And not only the church, but parents. In Scotland, we're looking at this right now, just as in Canada, but most importantly right now in Scotland. And by the way, Canada is such an interesting place right now because Canada is a civilization that works really hard not to make headlines. I mean, Canadians like worst nightmares making a headline. And boy, they're making some headlines right now. And it's fun to talk about. But that was his dad, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. But Justin Trudeau is everything Hollywood and New York thinks it wants in a political leader. And boy, is he stepping in it. And I must say, it's delightful to watch. I have become a Canadian trucker at heart, just watching this. Never said that before, but there it is. But you look at this and you recognize that the threat in Scotland, it would criminalize parents saying to their own teenage children, that's wrong. Not to mention saying, we're going to uphold a biblical understanding of marriage, of sexuality, and of gender identity in our home. Your home could become a criminal space. Now, the reason I want to talk about that is because many of these measures are sold to legislators as far less than they are. And so they'll be told, oh, look, this is going to apply, say, to professional counselors. Number one, that logic never holds. It's going to be applied to any conversation of a similar form. Because what the left sees is an understanding of authority. And then the left is very much at war with authority. And so the authority of the law is one thing. Yeah, but so long as mom and dad can say that's how this house is run, well, you're going to have to liberate people from that authority. Oh, and by the way, all the stuff, my point is all the stuff's tied together. The front page of the New York Times today, I believe it was, is a story. And by the way, this was the front page of the Courier-Journal Saturday. That's a newspaper in Louisville, Kentucky, unless you've ever heard. It's a very conservative newspaper. The Courier-Journal ran a story Saturday asking the question if under any circumstances it's right for the police to be called in to discipline children. I can guarantee you get a mass shooter in Michigan, then people forget that argument. In other words, call the police. But here's the thing. So the left has destroyed and subverted, I won't say destroyed, but has sought to subvert the discipline of children in the home and the entire structure of the authority of parents. And now wants to come back to ask if it's all right now to call in the police because you can't do anything else. That's the insanity of all this. And again, it's all tied together. Roe v. Wade, Obergefell, it's not just tied together, by the way, in the war over constitutional interpretation. That's real. That is real. And by the way, the great hope we have, humanly speaking, in a different outcome in the Dobbs case is because we now have so many justices of the Supreme Court who actually believe that the text of the Constitution is a binding document. Radical thought. It is really radical. I mean, it scares the left to death. And again, but what is the big issue? Thomas Sowell, some of you know that name, the very prominent economist, he's right. The big war of worldviews, there's more to it than this. He's not a Christian. But he's right about this. The great war of worldviews is between the constrained and the unconstrained. And so if you say you shouldn't, you hold to some form of a constrained worldview. You're constrained by some moral judgment. Of course, we also believe constrained by creation, constrained by reality. I often tell people, look, as a Christian theologian and apologist, almost all of my early years and almost all of my adult years have been based upon the assumption that the great apologetic challenges are epistemological. And I know, tweet that. In other words, they're about the authority of God's word, the existence and knowability of truth, which religion's true, did Christ really, was he bodily raised from the dead? Those are the big apologetic questions that I grew up with. The apologetic questions that your children are going to face is matter real? Does an XY and an XY chromosome difference actually mean anything? I mean, this is bizarre. And by the way, again, I just go back to the farm. Unless they mean something, you don't get any calves. Which is, I mean, again, there is no gender confusion that's workable on a farm. Even something that's not a something now in terms of its ability still has the genetic code and had that ability. It's a different world. We are looking at the C.S. Lewis, by the way, got this absolutely right in The Abolition of Man when he gave that great lecture and the horrors of the 20th century going on. And he said, here's the problem. He says we're asking men without chests, and by that what he meant was without courage, using the medieval category. We're asking men without courage to build a civilization when actually they're geldings. Because that's what we're producing in the British University today, is what he was saying. And that's true. And if it was true in the midpoint of the 20th century, good Lord, where are we now? So I'm here to bring you encouragement. And I know we're going to transition to a time of conversation. But I just want you to understand that all this is tied together. And so putting it back together means every vote in the legislature is important. Every case before the Supreme Court or a federal district court or even a local or state court is important. Every victory is to be savored. Every loss is to be lamented. But there is no one decision. There is no one law. There is no one Supreme Court ruling that solves our problem, because the rebellion is far deeper. And the unraveling has gone far further. And what I want to say is that I think pastors, most of your church members know how to answer most questions because you're faithful. But you're going to have to explain the why a whole lot more to hold on to young adults, teenagers and young people. Because the what evaporates in their minds without a sustained why. So we're going to teach a lot more biblical truth, or we're going to lose everybody. We're going to hold very clearly to the faith once for all delivered to the saints, or frankly, our churches will become as dangerous as the local college campus. And we're going to have to talk to each other about things we never had to talk to each other about. I was talking to a group of parents the other day, and I said, I just want you to know that I am encouraging you into the most awkward conversations of your life. Conversations your dad never had to have with you, that you're going to have routinely. I have parents come up to me and say, what do I do? I've got my 10-year-old boy, my 8-year-old girl. We're walking in the park, and 2 men are kissing on a bench. And I go, well, you talk. You talk. By the way, there actually is a moral argument called the Yuck Factor. It is. Leon Cass, President George W. Bush made Leon Cass head of the President's Commission on Bioethics, professor at the University of Chicago, a conservative academic. There are a few, thankfully. I count on it. But Leon Cass, he wrote an entire book on the Yuck Factor, and it's called The Wisdom of Disgust. Don't you love that? What a great subtitle. The Wisdom of Disgust. And my greatest example is a mom who told me about her 10-year-old son and the 8-year-old girl. They're walking to the park, and there are 2 men kissing on a bench. And it said the daughter, age 8, turned to her and said, what is that? Said the 10-year-old boy just stopped and went, yuck! And, Now, I'm not suggesting that that's the best political argument to make at any given moment in the legislature. But it's never not there. And that's where we have to come back and say, we are not any smarter than the rest of our fellow citizens. We're not any smarter than our neighbors. We are not morally superior to our neighbors in terms of our own hearts. But by God's grace, we know the truth because it's been revealed to us, and it's our responsibility not only to believe it, but to teach it and to share it, and yes, to have influence in the making of laws. Because we love our neighbor. Love of neighbor actually means we want the laws that will make our neighbor's marriage more secure. Rightly defined marriage. We want laws that will make children safer. We want laws that will help turn boys into men and girls into women. That's what we want of our schools. That's what we want of our society. We want a society that knows what reality is. And by the way, another thing, I was in a debate a couple of years ago on this, had someone say, well, you have no right to say that someone who declares to be a transgender female, you have no right to say that that person's not a female. I said, well, all I can say is I know two people who are going to say that person's a female. Did I get that right? Did I keep it straight? No, I got it wrong. You see, this is what happens. It'll confuse the daylights out of you. I'm talking about a biological male that claims to be a woman, okay? So that person still is a biological male. And I was told you have no right to say that. I said, I know two people are going to say it. Number one, or if they don't say it out loud, they're going to say it in some other way. Number one, the archaeologist who 5,000 years later, if the Lord tarries, comes back and does a genetic test. Guess what? That's a man. The dress will have dissolved. So will all the plastic surgery. I know, things you didn't know you were going to think about tonight. And then I said, I tell you who else is going to do it? The guy who has to operate on the prostate. And you can say that we need to be concerned with people with prostates, but you know what a person with a prostate is? A man with a problem. By the way, that's the mortality organ in men. You may have figured that out. Genesis 3, the moment you eat of this fruit of the forbidden tree, you shall surely die. And Adam's prostate began to enlarge. I know. I see. I told you I'd have your attention. And yeah, that's the way it works. Before the fall, prostate would have been just like it's supposed to be the whole time. Our job is to put civilization back together piece by piece, truth by truth, verse by verse. Our task is to reassemble what is being destroyed before our eyes. We should not underestimate the task. We're going to need each other. We need as many godly legislators. And look, we need as many people who stand for the truth, even if they don't understand fully why. I feel like we're in a situation, it reminds me of George S. Patton, who said, I want them to shoot first and ask me why second. Because I don't have time to tell them first they're dead if they don't shoot. And so I just want to say, we need young people who believe the right things in order that we can keep them alive long enough to help them to understand why, so that they will raise their children in the same truths. So we have an enormous challenge. It's been fun to be here with you tonight. I want to scare you to death in order to inspire you to the fact that God is sovereign. And he has called us to this fight at this time, and he doesn't call his people to a fight they're destined to lose. But we are destined to lose, but for Christ. And so it's in the name of Christ I end. And simply say, Jesus Christ is Lord. And anytime, any place, whatever the circumstance, that remains true if everything else falls. Okay. Thank you.